talking about that, right? We were talking about the Tower of Babylon in the first thing, when we first read. He didn't understand why God made their language different.
All right. Let's see. Share this now. All right. I think everyone who's here is rolled in, so we're gonna start. For reference, I got some emails. Yes, I guess I deleted the wrong concept questions quiz. So the questions for today were blank. I apologize for that. I'll make sure I check those beforehand. I had put them up and I guess I had removed the wrong one. So I apologize for that. But at the end of this presentation, we have those more important concept questions that I think get at the ideas a little bit more in regards to that. And so let's see. So today we're going to be talking about digestion and nutrition in animals. So the beginning of this presentation is going to be essentially a little bit of review in terms of concepts and ideas that we've already discussed that Professor Aiken went over in terms of metabolism and energy requirements of organisms. But now we're trying to look at that same information and see how it scales up, how different organisms, how they lead to different organisms having to eat and do different lifestyles in order to get the nutrition and those essential building blocks that are necessary for life. Are necessary for life. And then at the end, I'm going to be showing some examples of how these kind of lead to differences in eating with spiders. So the last slide, you won't need to know any specifics about, but I'll go over differences between like hunting spiders and spiders found in webs. So, I'll announce that. And if you don't like spiders, you can, head on out if you'd like. But obviously I put everything out on the YouTube after. And so today, we're going to be talking about metabolism. Obviously, we discussed this about how metabolism is a set of all reactions within a cell, within an organism, and how it is not just a single protein or enzyme doing its job. It's often a large set of reactions, right? You have some starting molecular stimulus that is causing the creation of a reaction, say enzyme 1, which is then upregulating enzyme B here, which may actually create another one that downregulates C or upregulates C. And so there are a lot of different ways these processes could carry out. But one thing that's really important is that in each of these cases, the plant is using energy and or some type of important particles to create what's going on in the future. And so, we discussed plants. We discussed how plants are using photosynthesis in order to create their own energy. But animals don't have that. And most animals are not producing their own energy. They have to take it in from their environment, from other organisms. And part of that is because of this metabolism, this constant cycle of energy and materials it needs to undergo these basic cell processes. And so, obviously metabolism is the sum of all energy used by cells. And enzymes are helping enzymes, which are helping enzymes. And so the body has to constantly produce these enzymes. And exactly as Professor Aiken just said, we're transforming, we're taking in materials. There are a lot of things that our body produces, but most of it they cannot, especially when it comes to energy. And so, we've discussed this before, this idea of proteins inhibiting proteins or inactivating proteins. But in this context, what I want you to know is that in order for these processes to happen, in order for, active proteins to get turned on to start breaking down, sucrose or some important molecule, in order to stop the breakdown or the creation of something, new proteins must be made. And then in this process, old proteins must also be replaced. Proteins will change shape, they will break down, they will dissolve, they will biodegrade. You will have proteins that are destroyed in the process of making things. You will have proteins which are used up or just start to degrade, once your body temperature starts to fluctuate, as we were saying before, thermoregulation. When your body isn't at the appropriate temperature, you need to use energy to heat yourself up. And so all of these are all reasons that you need to constantly be producing more materials. And because proteins are not alive, they can't regulate their own activities, right? So in order to turn them on and off, that requires even more materials just to control them, even if you were to say have those proteins and have them not be able to degrade or get destroyed. And so these changes can occur with the production of new proteins, which we know, and they will make others more or less effective. But again, you're producing enzymes. And so where do we get the materials in order to create these proteins, in order to create these enzymes, in order to keep these processes going? Because sometimes these activators or inhibitors are pure energy, right? Sometimes it's ATP, which needs to be given to these proteins in order for them to change. These proteins are not just happening within the cell, right? There's proteins that need to be replaced on the surface of the cell. There are proteins that need to be changed in all of these areas. You have translations, you have ribosomes, and all of that. And so there's a lot of energy that is lost during metabolism of an organism. And so, for instance, at the top here, we have organic food molecules that are coming in. This organism ate something else. Let's say it's an organism that just ate a plant. And so it's taking in a certain amount of materials. It has to then digest and absorb those materials. And while it's doing that, it's going to be losing energy as heat. So there's one spot that it's losing energy. Then after it's trying to push out, say, all of that extra materials that it couldn't break down because your body is imperfect, you can't possibly digest everything that you're given, you're going to lose energy in your poop, things that are not fully broken down. And that's why you have organisms that eat, feces, because there is materials in there that you can get out. You then have these nutrient molecules in your body cells. You're going to be losing, again, excess materials in nitrogenous wastes, extra proteins that you're going to be removing. You're then going to lose a massive amount of energy while undergoing, this cellular respiration. Obviously, the whole point is to create more energy, but there needs to be something in order to start it. Also, again, you're going to be losing heat as it's an imperfect system. Maybe we're creating more ATP and energy, but we're also losing heat, which is a different form of that energy. And then, just in general here, this section, cellular work and biosynthesis, moving a cell around, pumping things throughout the cell, all of that is going to create friction, is going to create heat. And so this all needs to be restored by how an organism is eating. And so when we look at this, what we're talking about again is this idea of chemical reactions, right? So we have these anabolic pathways, which take energy to make complicated materials. So we're going to have those. And as we said, those are often coupled with catabolic pathways to help break down molecules, right? One is releasing energy, one is using energy. And so while these will be coupled in metabolism in these different sections, it's again an imperfect system. We're creating energy here, but we're also losing energy in that form of heat. And so, we're trying to couple this to make it more efficient, but it's not going to be perfect. And so, energy in the cell, as we said, is primarily going to be used as ATP. We've discussed this before. And that as we break bonds, we'll be sending out energy, either by incorporating ATP or by breaking off these phosphate groups. We'll be, releasing energy. But one thing we need to note is that, and ATP is releasing energy and it's being used, right? But most of the energy that's actually released in the breaking of these bonds is released as heat, which is again not necessarily going to be able to be used by the cell directly. That will be, again, lost materials. And so even though we're creating these systems, we're trying to undergo each of these processes, detaching this phosphate will release energy, but it's not going to be completely picked up by the cell. And so some ATP will be used to, say, move things around the cell, vesicles being moved along these motor proteins, along the skeletal tracts. That requires energy. These membranes, doing this transport work, once again, requires energy. So where are we getting these ATP from? Well, obviously there's chemical work and there's mechanical work that needs to be done. And then there's also transporting work. And so all of these are just more ways that the animal needs to use energy during those different metabolic processes in order to keep going. And so what we're talking about today is how different organisms' lifestyles lead to them needing to eat different types of things. And so, nutrition is the act of taking in food, breaking it down, and trying to absorb what remains in order to be useful from an organism's. And so an organism's diet must supply a number of different things in order for them to properly survive. So first of all, we have that chemical energy, right? When we eat plants, we get ATP, we get sugars, we can translate those, we can create our energy through photorespiration, but we need some basic source for that chemical energy, since we are not, in fact, creating it from plants. There are then essential nutrients, different molecules that we're going to need in order to undergo those processes, inorganic compounds that our body is not naturally going to produce on their own. And so those are what we're going to need to eat. And so one thing we'll notice is that diets can be very complicated. You can eat and get energy, say chemical energy from your diet, but if you don't have the appropriate nutrients or things of those nature, you're still going to be malnourished and your body's not going to be able to undergo those processes very well. And then we have organic molecules. We have molecules that are different forms, say, of nitrogenous wastes that we need in order to create those proteins and enzymes. And those ourselves, say like nitrogen, we need to intake those as well. Our body's not going to be able to produce enough of it. And so organisms have evolved to be, these are the classic diets that you probably learned in biology when you were younger, right? You have herbivores, or organisms that feed primarily on plants, such as, horses, things like that. And so their requirements of what they need in their body are going to be different because what they're eating is supplying something different, right? The molecules that you're going to get from eating grass are going to be different because of the area of, the food web we're in, compared to, say, carnivores, which are organisms that only eat meat. If you didn't know this, you can look it up. Ladybugs are actually very vicious predators. Ladybugs are carnivorous. They eat other insects. And so they may look cute, but they're actually vicious animals. And then obviously you have omnivores, which are like us, organisms that can eat both plants and meat. And so we're going to look at how these different diets supply different things. And so again, there's this idea of chemical energy. We're getting those base sugars from the plants, but we need that, that energy within the system, much like a car needs gas. You have potential energy that is stored in these bonds in this food, and we're breaking it down in order to release that energy and also to release those smaller molecules. And so essential nutrients are these materials and molecules that are needed by the cell to create complex molecules, right? And so these are things that our body cannot naturally produce for one reason or another. Often, it's too complicated to add a brand new set of enzymes. We haven't evolved the appropriate enzymes or proteins in order to break it down, or it's just easier to get it elsewhere. For instance, our body, and a lot of organisms, will go over this in a minute, do a lot of symbiotic relationships with microorganisms, and they help us break down and produce nutrients and things that we normally can't eat. And so an organism's body must supply these molecules, anything that is naturally deficient in, and so the necessary building blocks. So for instance, and foremost, one thing we'll talk about that's really, really important is uptaking nitrogen, right? We need nitrogen for amino acid production. We need it to produce RNA. We need it to produce our DNA. We need it to produce any of those other nitrogenous based molecules in order to run all of our body. And so what we need to do is make sure that our diet takes in enough nitrogen. And so we'll talk about where nitrogen comes from in the environment, but these essential nutrients can generally be broken down into 4 different areas. So you have vitamins, minerals, essential fatty acids, and then essential amino acids. And so if you are not taking in any one of these particular things, you can be malnourished, even if you have all the other ones. And so essentially amino acids, one thing you learned is that amino acids, there are 20 different types that we need in order to make proteins, in order to create every one of the enzymes that are in our body. But most species can only produce roughly half of the 20 full amino acids, which means that their diet needs to include the other 10. Humans, I believe, can produce 14 or 15 of the 20 amino acids that we need. And so those other 5 need to come in from our diet. And so if you don't have enough of those, you become protein deficient, and that can end in muscle weakness, mental fog, general inability to regulate your body. And so, I guess we can produce 12. I forgot about that. And so we need 8 more in order to be considered healthy. In terms of where we get these amino acids, meat, meat usually contains all of the amino acids you need, because organisms that are eating meat that are higher up on the food chain are generally taking in eating other organisms, so they're getting those essential amino acids that they need in order to survive, and then they're storing them in their own skin or fat. And so if you eat meat, you generally can get all of the nitrogen and the amino acids you need, but most plants don't have all of these essential amino acids. But plants, because of their diversity, if you eat, have your diet of at least 2 or 3 different types of plants, you can get all those essential amino acids. So it's not that you can't get all of these important materials from being a vegetarian or a vegan. It's just a little bit harder because plants don't have all of those nutrients in them. And so if you make up an appropriate diet with these combinations, you can have these complete amino acids. So for instance, if you look at these essential amino acids and you look at corn, out of these 8 amino acids that humans need to survive, corn is missing, 2 of them. You would have to eat beans or legumes in order to get this lysine or these other things right here. But again, once you combine them, you start being able to create all the appropriate materials that you need. And so complete meals would be, just rice and beans, bread and peanut butter, rice and tofu. Those combinations have all of these 8 amino acids that we need to survive. And so it just requires you to be a little bit more careful about what you eat to make sure that you're feeling well. And so these other essentials that we have are essential fatty acids. So if you remember, we have those plasma membranes, those phospholipid membranes that we have covering all of our cells that we need to protect ourselves from the environment, to keep ourselves within that space, that homeostasis, that appropriate environment. And so we need more fatty acids in order to produce this. And so that's what we get from, unsaturated fats. So for example, bread, when we eat bread, we get those lipids, and our body breaks down those lipids so that we can absorb them. And so I'm only going to go a little bit into each of these essentials and what we need them. And I'm going to talk more about how we actually break them down and that process. But then you also have, again, these minerals. And so you have inorganic nutrients, so calcium that you need in order to act as a neurotransmitter, phosphorus in order to make ATP, sodium in order to act as an ion channel pump. All of these minerals we're going to need to constantly take in, because as we excrete things, we're actually going to be losing it. As I said, in our pee, in our poop, we are losing these extra calcium, phosphorus, and sodium. And obviously our body tries to retake up some of them, but it's not efficient. And we're going to be losing things the entire time. And so, you have those, and then you have vitamins, which are organic molecules required in small doses. And so the difference between vitamins and minerals are that vitamins are organic molecules, but also vitamins are often changed in form. So minerals will take those nutrients, will incorporate them into something else. Vitamins are often have to be processed. And so they're changed from some base form into another useful molecule by proteins. So for instance, with enzymes, you can take B2 and you can transfer it into FAD, and you could use that in your metabolic processes. But it has to come from some base form. It's too complicated to build up in your body. And so, as Charlie is saying here, he's just going to buy the basics. He's going to have vitamins so he can produce all of those appropriate metabolic processes. He's going to buy milk so he can get some fatty acids and get some proteins, and then perhaps some materials in it, and he's going to sustain himself on the bare minimum. Is that the healthiest? No. Can you survive on it? Yes. You could be a little malnourished. You could have issues in different parts of homeostasis, but overall, you might be alive. And yes, as Professor Hayden saying, he might be missing some essential amino acids. He's not getting those appropriate meats or those appropriate vegetables, most likely. And so organisms are going to be, animals are going to be getting their food, as I said, in many different ways, right? They're going to be doing this at different scales. And it's actually amazing the diversity at which organisms can eat and get the exact same nutritions. So you have things like substrate feeders, which are organisms that live on or in their food source. Most easily think of insects that eat plants. Caterpillars are eating plants. They're taking in those different sugars and nutrients. And so you have organisms that are living like that. You have fluid feeders, so organisms that are actually drinking your blood. So you could consider this kind of spiders. We'll get into that later. But you have organisms that are just taking blood. If you think about it, our blood is trying to transfer nutrients to all of our cells. And so our blood is essentially like that phloem inside of a plant, right? It's carrying all of the sugars and oxygen throughout our environment. And so what's a really good place to get nutrients? The direct source in the highway. So you have creatures such as mosquitoes, ticks, which are biting and directly injecting into our transportation system and pulling in those nutrients. I think some of the most impressive ones are these suspension feeders. So whales. Whales are some of the biggest animals on Earth. Humpback whales are the largest organism on the planet. And how do they eat? They are swimming through water and they're pulling in krill. They are eating a mixture of plankton and plants, but then they're also eating krill and little microscopic organisms that are floating throughout the water. And so they're swimming and they're trying to get as many nutrients, and they're huge, right? So they need a lot to sustain themselves. Yes, and I believe blue whale would be the biggest, I believe. The vast majority of organisms, though, are this idea of bulk feeders. And so bulk feeders are organisms that eat large pieces of food. We are a bulk eater. Obviously, looking at this is a snake. There's a snake that is actually eating a deer. And obviously, we're not going to unhinge our jaws and eat nearly as large of a portion as a snake, but we're still eating chunks of food. We're eating an entire piece of steak. We're eating this larger food that needs to be broken down and processed much more prior to us being able to absorb all the nutrients in it. And so bulk feeders have to have very intricate digestive systems in order to really get all of the nutrients out of it. Sarah says that not to underestimate her. That's really funny. I like that. And so how do bulk feeders get out all of these nutrients from their food? And so that's why we have digestive systems and digestive processes. And one thing we'll talk about is the fact that, our digestive system here on the left, while cute, is also made up of many different parts. You have liver, stomach, intestine, small intestine, gallbladder, pancreas. All of these things are helping digest food in different ways because, again, all of our processes are inefficient, and we want to make sure that as we're digesting these large pieces of food that we can get all of the nutrients out of it. And so digestion is this breakdown of food into molecules that the body can absorb. If you think of it this way, our cells are protected, right? They have the semi-permeable membrane. They have all of these protective agencies. All of these molecules, a lot of them and most of them are too big to directly be absorbed by the cell. The cell cannot just take an entire amino acid and put it into our cell membrane. It's too big. It's not going to pass that bilipid layer. So what is it going to need to do? It needs to be broken down into smaller pieces so it can be transported to the appropriate place, transported across the right membrane. And so proteins, carbohydrates, for the cell wall, nucleic acids are all too big to pass through the membrane, and so we need to digest them. After they're digested and we put them into the appropriate place, then we can put them back together whenever necessary. We have these building blocks of these nucleic acids, and now we can put them back together into the appropriate amino acid that we might need. Or they might be broken down and absorbed depending on where they are and what they're moving. Once again, these molecules are not living, right? They're floating around and bouncing around, diffusing. And so depending on where they are, they might get treated slightly different. And so chemical digestion is most often adding water. So, an enzyme will come over, grab some molecule, let's say it's a protein or a nucleic acid. It will bond water to it and break it down. If you remember, a lot of these proteins and these organic molecules are polypeptides. And so they are organic molecules that are kept together by the removal of water. And so by adding water back, we can actually break them back down and reverse that process, using enzymes. So enzymes helping enzymes helping enzymes. But one thing that is really important about that is the fact that we need to then absorb these molecules, right? We need to break them down and we need to absorb them. But remember that, what's the similarity between what we're made of and what we're trying to absorb, right? They're exactly the same thing. We are made of proteins, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. And so we need to be careful when we're digesting things to make sure that we're not innately digesting ourselves. And that's why organisms have all of these different digestive compartments, right? If you were just to, if you were to put a piece of bread in your mouth and you innately tried to break down carbon that's in that bread, what are you going to do? You're going to dissolve your tongue in your mouth. And so obviously, these digestive processes have to happen in particular areas. And then absorption of those things also have to happen in a particular area, right? You can't just try to absorb everything as you're breaking it down. And so absorption is obviously the uptake of these smaller molecules and simple sugars into our processes. And then last but not least, you have elimination, which is, excretion, the movement of undigested material out of your system. And so, as I said, we all need stomachs and help to break down these macromolecules. And so, these macromolecules, again, are common throughout all cells. And so how do we not hurt ourselves, when we do this? So we have to digest in special compartments that are lined in special cells. Once again, we have different types of tissue, right? We have those external tissues that, that dermal tissue, that outside tissue that's protecting our cells, right? So we're going to have particular compartments that are built to break down specific parts of molecules, because every molecule, once again, is not going to be broken down by the same enzymes. And then in this also continuation, those enzymes are not all going to work at the best at the same environment, right? Certain things, such as our digestive enzymes in our stomach, work at lower pH, right? We need to have a very acidic environment to break down stuff in our stomach. And so these digestive compartments are going to be creating their own mini homeostasis, their own mini environments to help break things down. And so depending on our diets, these compartments will vary greatly amongst organisms. And so the first one I'm going to show you is the idea of cellular digestion, or these organisms that are extremely small and thin. And so on a base level, cellular digestion is the use of vacuoles to digest, right? Within cells, they need to break down molecules, right? So what happens within a cell? They will isolate that cell, that molecule into a vacuole. They can pump those out of the cell, or they could use those vacuoles to digest something. That vacuole might be filled with a specific types of enzyme. And so that vacuole is essentially a mini stomach, right? It is a specialized compartment to break things down so that the rest of the cell isn't affected by it. And so I'll show you a video of these small organisms here. But then we have this idea of these much more intricate stomach systems, right? Organisms such as, carnivores need to have way more stomachs, right? For here, we have a carnivore, we have a short intestine, a colon, and then we have this cecum, which is helping break stuff down before it's excreted. For organisms that are breaking down, say, plant matter, which is much more difficult, and, it has that waxy layer, it has all of these really tough fibers in it, those organisms need to have way more parts. So for instance, these rumen organisms, such as cows, such as deer, have 4 chambers to their stomach alone, which are all doing different organic processes and helping break down these parts, which then leads to an extremely long rumen, and then an extremely long spiral cord and cecum, and all of these large intestines. And so all of this is this length and this distance is to, again, maximize all of the nutrients we're able to break down as well as absorb. And so this is what we call extracellular digestion, or the use of a stomach. And so I'm not going to play this video because we're running out of time. But this video is actually on your homework for Friday. And so for Friday, for your homework, what I want you to do is answer some questions about essentially symbiosis between organisms that are breaking down grass, that have this rumen, and microbacteria. Organisms that are breaking down this ruminant organisms are very similar to our own stomachs, where they have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in order to help digest things the body normally can't or would be too difficult. And so I'd like you to learn a little bit more about that, and the homework will guide you through that. But what I want you to know now, what's most important, is that most organisms have sequences of different digestive components that help them break down different materials, and each absorb a different spectrum of molecules. Different molecules. And so animals form bonds with microorganisms, prokaryotes, bacteria, to help them break down tough molecules, such as, say, cell walls. Sorry. Let's go over here. And so this video here is just going to be talking about these jellyfish. So jellyfish are extremely thin organisms, right? They have, they're only a couple of layers thick. If you look at it, this is the comb of a jellyfish, and you can see that you can almost see through it, right? There are so few cells in this organism. And so if you look through these channels, these radial canals, these are actually the equivalent of that organism's veins and arteries and phloem. This is actually where each of the molecules that are being digested and moved around will flow. And so we'll look at that real quickly. And so this is what's called a gastrovascular canal. And these are areas that are so thin that that molecules can just move by slight pumping or by diffusion. And so a cool thing about these jellyfish actually is they're so thin that as they swim, they actually get oxygen to diffuse across this top layer. And so you see this digested fluid, food is actually flowing through these canals and getting pumped throughout the animal. And so it's actually, this digestion is all done intracellularly. So there's no stomach, right? These molecules are being pumped to some of these different areas. Depending on the part, it might get pumped to a stomach, but it's going to get broken down and then pumped back through the body. And so it's actually going to be absorbed into each of these cells to be completely broken down. And so right here, you can see this food being slowly broken down and being pumped throughout it. And so you don't need to know what this is, but they're just talking about these different structures on the plant, and on the jellyfish, and how it's used to sense its environment. And so even the simplest organisms are going to have to break down molecules and transport it. Unfortunately, unfortunately, it's a skinny organism. It's thin, so it doesn't have to worry too much about this processing. But for larger organisms such as us, it's going to be much more complicated, right? And so obviously, organisms have physical adaptations which are made for their particular diet, right? Carnivores, we can tell often from their bones, from their skull, if they're a carnivore, right? They're going to have different teeth that are going to help them break down different types of food, right? Carnivores are going to have canines, so they're going to be ripping flesh, right? Flesh is a lot easier to take apart than, say, these waxy layers of plants. Herbivores, such as cows, are instead going to have grinding teeth. They're going to have to constantly grind down that cell wall, that extra area on the outside of the cell. And obviously, we're omnivores, so we have a mixture of these two teeth. But if we look at these digestive components, we can see how complicated this actual breakdown is. So for instance, just looking at us, right, in the human digestive system, once we put something into our mouth, right, that's where digestion begins. You immediately have salivary amylase being produced, right? You have this protein that's now going to start breaking down these smaller polysaccharides, so starches, right? That's why when you put bread in your mouth, it starts becoming sweet, right? If you let it sit there for a little bit, because you're breaking down these starches and these sucrase into smaller molecules. You're beginning to break down this. Obviously, none of these molecules are going to break down your own skin, right? We're trying to break down just sugars and things like that. Then everything gets pushed into your stomach. And then in your stomach, you start breaking down proteins, right? You have pepsin, you have small polypeptides that are getting produced. You have a different area that's going to be broken down. Then we move into the small intestine. And now we really start getting into digestion, right? In the small intestine, that's where we have this symbiotic relationship with microbes. And so we'll start breaking down more molecules and more complicated ones. And so proteins are going to start being broken down more. You have these small polypeptides, which are now going to be broken down by pancreatic fluids. In cases, you're going to have bile salts digesting fats. So for instance, I don't have a gallbladder. I had to have mine removed. And so when it comes to intestinal issues, I have a lot because I can't naturally produce bile at a efficient rate. And so fat globules do not get digested well in my stomach. So if I eat oily things, if I eat fatty things, that's not going to actually be processed very much in my stomach. It's going to come straight through me. And so this is, the same thing as if someone has, say, lactose intolerant, right? If you can't break down that milk that's in your system, that lactose, it's going to go through your system and it's going to cause problems. In fact, you may be allergic to it. It may cause diarrhea or things like that. And so people actually have varieties as well as organisms of the microbes in their stomachs and their intestines that actually will decide what they can't and can't produce. Some people can, once again, can break down milk, some can't. Some can break down certain sugars, others can't. So there's actually a very interesting thing where scientists have been doing now is they've actually been transferring gut microbes and colon microbes between people. So you can actually get like a probiotic poop injection in which they'll take say the excrement of someone and the bacteria that are found in there in someone with a healthy stomach system, and they will put it into someone else. Those microbes will start to repopulate, and the person who got the transplant will actually be able to break down food more efficiently in a way that they haven't done before. And so, yeah, you can do fecal transplants. But the whole idea is that we are breaking down specific things in specific parts of our stomach. The intestine is where we start breaking down RNA and DNA and reabsorbing those nucleotides. And so depending on what you're missing, say you're not absorbing enough nutrients, your nucleotides in your stomach, the doctor knows to look at your small intestine and how it functions. And so for us, we have these 4 spots, but what you'll see in that video when you look at cow digestion is this can be much more complicated in terms of what is being broken down. And so in terms of this sequence, I would like you to know the consequences of having to separate out each of your different processes and think about why, we might not break down all of these chemicals or these more larger organisms until we get down into different compartments in our stomach. Essentially, how does diet dictate your physical adaptations, and how do these adaptations help keep homeostasis, but also how do we absorb these appropriate nutrients for all that? All of this is tied together in terms of keeping our systems together and having the appropriate building blocks. All right. And so, as an example, sorry, this should be hidden. As an example of these different types of digestive enzymes we may have in this system, I'm going to go over spiders and these different types of spiders we have. So for instance, here's a jumping spider. They are the cutest spiders. They have these big eyes. Sometimes they wear water droplets as hat. I'm sure you might have seen that. They're super cute. But here it's eating a fly. And so what kind of digestive enzymes or this organism is going to have is going to depend on what it's eating, right? And so spiders actually do a cool thing called external digestion. So instead of taking something in and fully digesting it in their stomach, spiders will do pre-digestion outside of their body. And so when a spider is actually injecting, say, this fly with venom in order to kill it, in order to paralyze it, it's also actually injecting that organism with digestive enzymes. And so it's essentially spitting stomach acid into this organism to pre-digest it. And so it doesn't have to have a compartment to do that because it's actually digesting it in the compartment of that organism's body. But what different enzymes it's going to need to aid in that digestion are going to vary compared to, say, what we're eating. So, for instance, first and foremost, there are chitinases. So, chitin is the exoskeleton of organisms and of insects and what it's made of. And so, the spider is going to need chitinases in order to help break down that external barrier, to break down that tough exoskeleton. And so this kind of gets at the idea that if you don't have those appropriate proteins, you can't eat anything and you can't digest it and it won't help. And so chitinases is a structural carbohydrate, as you said, so you need to be able to break that down. Then you have these other more broad and general carbohydrates. So breaking down breaking down those proteins that are on your cell walls, things like that. And so some of these might have multiple purposes. So for instance, chitinases, one thing that's cool when we talk about fungi is that fungus are actually made, their cell walls are made of the same thing as insects. And so in order to break down any fungi that might be on this organism or in this organism, these chitinases also help them. And so there are multiple reasons that you may have these. Then obviously you need to break down fats, especially in carnivores. Fats are really where you're storing all those amino acids, right? That flesh and those fats. And so you have lipases that are breaking those fats down. And I'm not sure if Professor Aiken mentioned this, but as a quick note, if you are looking at a chemical and it ends in ace or aces, that usually means that it's an enzyme. Most of the time it's going to be an enzyme, and usually if you cut off the ace, it'll tell you what it's breaking down. So chitinase breaks down chitin. Sucrase breaks down sucrose. Lactase breaks down lactose. And so that's generally something that you'll need to notice. And then also we have these proteinases. So they destroy all the proteins and help break down the exoskeletons. Oh, and that's a good point Professor Aiken said. Not all enzymes are aces. You can have amino acids that are acting as enzymes. You can have other molecules that are acting as enzymes, as long as they're helping aid a process. But if you see an ace, it's most likely an enzyme. But one thing that's interesting about these spiders is actually depending on their lifestyle, they're actually going to consume more or less of an insect as they're eating it. And so that actually will lend itself to them having different digestive enzymes because their digestive processes are different. And so enzymes vary in their structure and their job, and they're specialized for the diet of an organism. And obviously there are a lot of things, as I was saying, such as, this chitin that is very ubiquitous in the environment. There are a lot of these molecules, these proteins, RNAs and DNAs that are held true and have evolved to be in many organisms. And so there will be some of these that are very consistent. You're always going to have different types of lipases and proteinases, but which exactly ones will be different, once again, depending on what amino acids or things they have to go. All right, so it's 11:19. So if you have to go, you can go, but I'm just going to talk a little bit more about spider digestion. I think I have 2 more slides. And if you have any questions or anything, we'll be here. But again, I'll put this on YouTube. And so the anatomy of a spider is very interesting. So when you look at a spider, it has these 2 parts of its body, right? The front half and the back half. The back half, this opistosoma, is actually where all of the important organs of the spider are. So this is where its heart, its midgut, its anus, its ovaries, its lungs, its silk glands all are. The front of the spider is mostly its brain and then its legs. But what they also have is what's called a sucking stomach. And so this sucking stomach is essentially like a straw. It pumps things in and out. And so it does have a digestive stomach that's extremely small, and helps absorb and break down some processes. But most of the digestion is coming from the pushing out of this fluid through the mouth of the spider. And so spiders inject their prey with venom to not only poison and disable them, but to start digesting them. So there are little to no digestive enzymes in their initial bite when they inject something. But as that organism has starting to, starts to slow down, then the spider will rebite into it and start injecting these digestive enzymes into their bite. And so they're going to utilize both external and internal digestion. And so they're regurgitating digestive fluids from their mouth into and onto the prey. So they're breaking down that outside exoskeleton, but then they're also dissolving all of the proteins and muscle and fiber that is inside this shell. Think of it as I'll show, is a Capri Sun, right? It's ignoring all of the outside and it's just going to be drinking what's on the inside. And so depending on if a spider is a wandering spider, so if it's a tarantula, a huntsman, that jumping spider, it's going to have different digestive enzymes than web building spiders. So spiders that you would find outside your window, making a web sitting outside on your porch or on your car. And so this comes from the fact that they will actually devour their prey differently depending on how they're hunting. So wandering spiders, for instance, often have rough patches on their mouth parts that they actually help to grind prey into pulp as they digest them. So again, think of it as a Capri Sun. So wandering spiders like tarantulas are going to squeeze and crunch their prey into a little ball. And often you won't find a carcass, you'll find just a little nub of what it once was. And so like this child, I don't know if you've seen this show, it's called Fresh Off the Boat. It's about a Asian family that moves in the 90s to mostly white area, and it goes over a lot of culture. It's really cool. I love this show. But this little kid, you can see if that was an insect, he's squeezing out all of the nutrients, leaving that exoskeleton core, and then just pushing out all the nutrients. And so this digestion is going to happen on the inside, first and foremost. And so that's how those spiders are going to eat. And I'll show you a video in a second. Web building spiders are actually generally much bigger babies. So if you're handling a spider and a spider's in a web, most likely it's not going to bite you. They're usually afraid of everything, let alone things that are bigger. They will only usually attack things that are in their web. And so generally they will disable prey by biting them really quickly. And then wrapping them up and letting them die from, say, their venomation or the paralysis. And so generally they're going to leave the entire carcass because they're not actually going to crumple that organism. They're actually just going to bite through their silk and do it. And so if we look at this is the mouth parts of a spider. Generally here, this is the fangs and this is the mouth. This is the mouth of these wandering spiders and these tarantulas. You can see that there's this ridging here. And so this is actually kind of the equivalent of their teeth. And so they'll rub an insect on this in order to help break it down into smaller pieces. And so let's look at what how these spiders digest. This is going to be the bird catching or the Goliath bird eating spider, which sometimes eats birds. It just happened to be that the first time that. And so one cool thing we didn't talk about, I didn't mention with spiders, is how spiders are hairy and have all these things. They're in an exoskeleton. All their cells are inside, right? So they have a hard time perceiving what's actually happening outside of their shell. And so all of these hairs are finely tuned so they can pick up on things touching them, but also on air currents. So these little thin ones will actually... No?
I don't have any questions.
Okay. All right. Let's see. I guess I will stop the recording there.